Good morning and welcome to our viewers. I'm Carrie Cordero with the Center for a New American Security, and I'm delighted that you're here with us to talk about voter attitudes and foreign influence protecting the vote. Today's conversation is part of a collaboration between the Center for a New American Security, the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which is part of Penn Law, and the Annenberg Public Policy Center, also of the University of Pennsylvania. Before I introduce the terrific group of experts who will be joining me for the next hour, a couple notes. This discussion is being live streamed, and you can post your comments and questions on Twitter using the hashtag #ProtectingDemocracy2020. And I hope that you'll check out our written commentary series that is on the Center for a New American Security's website. There are articles there that we've been publishing over the last 7 weeks, ranging from how Europe has addressed foreign influence to new research on how US voters view the issue of foreign influence in our elections, to how states and the federal government are working to secure the election from a cybersecurity perspective. My sincere thanks to all of the expert authors who contributed to that commentary series. I hope that you'll come away from this discussion with a deeper understanding of the challenges, both foreign and domestic, confronting our upcoming November election. But more importantly, our conversation for the next hour is going to focus on not just what Washington is doing, but how voters are confronting the challenges to the election and what government, civil society, and each of us can do to foster confidence that the upcoming election will be secure, will be administered fairly, and with an outcome that we can all have confidence in, regardless of which candidate wins. To dive into that discussion, I could not be joined by a group better situated to explore the issues of foreign influence, securing the election, and enhancing voter confidence. I'm delighted to be joined today by Scott Bates, who is the Deputy Secretary of the State of Connecticut, Vanita Gupta, the President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Bill Kristol, the Director of Defending Democracy Together and the Editor-at-Large of the Bulwark, and Laura Rosenberger, the Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy of the German Marshall Fund. Welcome to all of the panelists, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. I want to start out recognizing that this conversation really could not be more timely given some ongoing testimony that is going on today from FBI Director Chris Wray, who just this morning confirmed that there are in fact very active Russian efforts to affect this year's election, and that their goal is to sow discord and to denigrate the Vice President Biden, one of the two candidates. Laura Rosenberger, I'm first going to come to you because I want to start out our conversation on this issue of foreign influence and disinformation, which you have spent so much time researching. Could you just start us out by setting the stage of the current state of play? What do we know about foreign interference in our upcoming election as compared to 2016, particularly as it relates to online influence? Laura.
Well, thanks so much, Carrie, and to CNAS and all the partners for convening this really important conversation today. And it's great to be here alongside the other panelists for this conversation. So to set the stage, actually, what I'd like to do is step back, because while I know that the conversation today is focused around foreign influence and voter attitudes around the election, I think when it comes to foreign interference, it's really important to understand that this is a chronic condition. It's a chronic condition that takes advantage of weaknesses within our domestic body politic, and it's one that doesn't begin and end with particular election cycles. I would say, though, that it's a condition that becomes acute around particular elections. You have unique vulnerabilities that enter the body politic around elections, particularly focused public attitudes and peaked media debates. You have candidates who are running obviously for very particular offices and a zero-sum equation to victory. And you have electoral infrastructure that comes into play that is really unique around election cycles. And so while I know the bulk of our conversation today is going to be focused around the foreign interference efforts that are happening with respect to the election, I think it's incredibly important that we understand that these particular activities are taking place as part of this longer and ongoing cycle. And so when you ask about how today's activities compare to 2016, I think it's important again to just recognize that those activities never stopped. They've evolved. This is not a sort of point of contrast of two separate operations, particularly when it comes to what Russia's doing. These operations have evolved over time. In fact, in many ways, what I would argue that Russia is doing, I was asked in a different event yesterday about sort of what is Russia injecting today into the American political system. And my answer was, it's less what Russia's injecting and more what Russia is actually taking out of the body, right? Pulling out. Reoxygenating with particular new energy and then injecting back in a particularly acute way in order to infect in a greater way the domestic debates that we're having. In other words, we're doing a lot of the manipulation to ourselves. Russia in particular just sort of rides on top and is able to pick at the scabs and inject particular vulnerabilities or take advantage of particular vulnerabilities. Now, certainly, as you noted from Director Ray's comments there, we definitely see very active efforts by Russia. And we know that the Treasury Department actually just last week actually sanctioned under an order, an executive order that President Trump himself had signed, several Russian or Russian-linked individuals for active interference efforts in the 2020 election. So there's no question that, in fact, these active efforts are underway. The intelligence community has also talked about the efforts of two other foreign actors that are engaging in interference efforts with respect to US democracy. China is one that they have named. My own assessment, based on what we see in both the IC statements and in an analysis of the online activity that you asked about in particular, Carrie, is that China's efforts are largely in that more ongoing category, less election focused and more focused about shaping political discourse with respect to China and denigrating democracy itself. And then the third piece that we see is really from Iranian actors. And while their tactics tend to look a little bit more like Russia's, the chaos destruction sort of approach that we see from Russia so much, Iran's, I think, ambitions are different and smaller. It's usually about Iran's own particular interests with respect to attitudes towards it. We see a little bit of testing out different tactics that Russia also uses, but again, much sort of smaller scale at least from what we've seen from Iran to date. Last point on this, just to frame the comments here, is that again, while I think that when it comes to the election-focused foreign interference efforts, there is a tendency, just like the broader horse race conversation we see in the media of who's up, who's down, to focus on who is each actor helping. And I think that it's really important to bear in mind that the goal of these interference operations may be in part to help one candidate or another, but in all of these cases, the overarching goal is to undermine democracy itself, make us lose faith in the electoral process, make us lose faith in election integrity, and really doubt ourselves and our institutions. And so I think that that's really important to bear in mind as we go through this conversation today.
Laura, thanks for that terrific scene setter. And that really is that last issue that you described in terms of election integrity. I mean, that's really what is motivating, has motivated the symposium that CNAS and CERL have put on with APPC today, and has motivated our interest in this issue. In other words, what can we be doing to foster that integrity in the election and not allow those foreign influence efforts to unduly influence the way that voters are thinking about it. And also your context in terms of the distinguishing between the intentions and the activities of the different foreign actors, I think is a really important distinction. We've been featuring a series of commentary articles as part of this series. And one of those is from Chris Krebs, the CISA director, the director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, who's responsible for the federal government activities as they relate to trying to secure the election. But we have with us today a state elections official. And so I want to now bring into the conversation Scott Bates, who's the Deputy Secretary of State for Connecticut. Scott, you also participated in our written commentary series, and we thank you for doing that and direct our listeners to take a look at that. Can you talk a little bit now and explain to our viewers from the state perspective, how is it in terms of securing the election and that critical confidence piece that Laura described? What are you doing at the state level to help foster integrity in the election?
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, great. Trust and public confidence in our election system underpins everything in democracy. We took it for granted for so long in the United States, but it's just like the rule of law itself. You can have the black letter law, but unless there's a culture of compliance and there's an underlying norms and attitudes that support it, it's not real. And so I can tell you from the state perspective, I'll never forget my first day on the job, which was in December 2016. Jay Johnson, the Secretary of Homeland Security, got on the phone with all the secretaries of state and said, we're looking at designating elections as critical infrastructure. And it was fascinating because after he got off the call, and that was because of the Russian interference, Republicans, I won't characterize all of them, but many who are libertarian bent were like, heck no, we don't want that kind of federal oversight. And then liberal Democrats were kind of like, geez, this guy Trump's coming in. So we're nervous about that. But it became an issue that we had to take seriously and was thrust upon us. And we started talking with the Department of Homeland Security. And these are two very different cultures. Elections are all about transparency. Homeland Security, DHS, not always the case about being so forthcoming, but we had a series of get-togethers, and it's been an evolving and a very positive relationship. What our Secretary of State did, Denise Merrill, she was head of the National Association of Secretaries of State. And she said, look, there's $400 million sitting around that Congress had authorized but never appropriated for election security, the Help America Votes Act. What if we use that to take on these challenges? Because the fact is, in a state like Connecticut, and most states are in the same boat, there are very few resources at the state level available for election security and election systems. It's a very decentralized system across the country. And we're talking about nation states taking on states. How in the world can we defend ourselves? So the Secretary Merrill and others knew that we needed partnerships. So what we did in Connecticut, first of all, we got that Help America Votes Act money dedicated to the states. That was done by Congress and the president, and a great partnership there to actually move that forward. We convened locally an unprecedented partnership series, which really was to meet this kind of unprecedented challenge. That meant getting the registrars of voters, the town clerks, as kind of local officials in the same room with DHS regional, with Connecticut State Police, National Guard, with our folks. And we talked about what will we do with this $5.4 million to strengthen our posture in cybersecurity. And this goes to the disinformation piece, because at the end of the day, there can be weird memes out there or disinformation, but the worst thing that can happen is that our systems themselves are compromised, and that leads to people losing their faith in efficient, effective election administration. I like to say, if we're doing our job well, nobody knows it. And that's always our goal. So we put that task force together. Secretary Merrill and I met with the congressional delegation, the Connecticut delegation, and talked about what we're going to do with those resources. And we essentially decided to have 3 lines of operation. The first is to protect state and local election systems themselves. So we worked together with the Connecticut National Guard to do cybersecurity assessments for all the 169 towns around Connecticut and figure out what it is that they may need for cybersecurity. We're doing network upgrades and new workstations. So that's kind of making sure that the local systems don't get compromised. The second line of operation is that we've been investing in training and personnel. So think of 169 towns. each has 2 registrars of voter, one a Democrat, one Republican. They work together to make sure the lists are good, a town clerk. We hired IT specialists, 5 election security officers to work with all the locals to make sure they have their security protocols in order. And then finally, the third line of operation has to go specifically with disinformation. We're putting about 10% of the money, and thank God we got CARES Act money dedicated to elections. It's about $5 million in our case. We're taking that, we've put out absentee ballot applications and absentee ballots to everybody. Connecticut went from 6%, 6 to 66% participation by absentee balloting. So we maintain the integrity of our system in the midst of a pandemic, which, by the way, if that pandemic had hit in October, I don't think we could have had an election. But working together, having these resources, we rallied local officials to be able to do it. And just to wrap up that bit, our last bit on disinformation, we've hired an election information security analyst to look at the dark web and other places if there's any kind of bogus information out there about Connecticut's election system. We're working with MITRE to put the Squint system in place with local officials doing a see something, say something. So it's partnerships across the board is the only way that we can defend ourselves.
Well, thanks for those insights into how this is being addressed at the state level, because so much here in Washington, we focused on what Washington is doing. And we did actually, as part of this series, Claire Finkelstein and I did an interview with CISA Director Chris Krebs that we're going to release later this afternoon in a podcast. And one of the things that he said was that individuals who are conducting elections at the state level are they're professionals at doing the administration of elections, and that very fact, that the fact that individuals who are working at the state level, you mentioned town, the person in charge of the town council and so forth, who are doing these types of activities, that activity should give voters confidence that there are professionals at the local and state level who are working to secure the elections. I want to turn to Vanita Gupta to speak to what civil society and what other organizations across the country are doing. Vanita, earlier this year, it looked like foreign interference might be the primary challenge to the election. And then we were all hit with this public health crisis of the coronavirus pandemic. And so as we near November 3rd, it looks like there's a much broader domestic political effort to cause confusion. And some of this is related to the pandemic itself, to cause confusion about how people can vote safely and whether they can have confidence in the election. Scott Bates just discussed what state governments can do and what's happening at the local level. Can you talk a little bit and inform our viewers and our listeners about what organizations like yours are doing in order to provide confidence in this election this fall?
Sure. It's great to be here. I want to pull back to something that Laura said at the opening, which is there are a lot of people challenging our faith at this moment in our democratic institutions, and that is a very intentional strategy. And that what we saw the Russians do in 2016 and what we are continuing to see them and other foreign actors do is to really prey on what are already pre-existing, long-standing domestic vulnerabilities, targeting, in 2016, the Senate and House Intel reports revealed that Russians were deliberately targeting African-American voters to get them to not participate, to not vote, to chill their participation, a form of voter suppression. But these are not kind of tactics and strategies that the Russians thought up of. This has been longstanding in our nation's history in the fight for opening up the access to voting rights into the franchise for all communities. And I think that is a really important through line that we have to understand if we are at all to combat some of the impediments to our democracy at this moment. And attacking the integrity of our election process is one of the main ways that authoritarianism takes root. It is one of the main ways it has taken root all over the world. And to have officials do that, and the danger of having the media amplify these kinds of messages is one of the things that I think as civil society has been combating. So an organization like mine, the Leadership Conference, 70 years in existence this year, has been long involved in the fight for voting rights and to protect the right to vote, and also to ensure that when people vote, their ballots are counted. This has been part of a longstanding effort. There is no question that at the start of 2020, we anticipated as civil rights advocates, nonpartisan civil rights advocates, that we would see efforts to impede the right to vote in 2020 at a level that maybe we haven't seen before. This is, as I said, there have been, the last decade has seen a lot of new and nefarious ways to try to create impediments to voters exercising their right to vote, particularly voters of color and other vulnerable communities. But COVID, created a whole new opportunity, frankly, for vote suppression. In a lot of ways, what we are seeing is some officials, and sometimes amplified on social media, trying to weaponize COVID to create and stoke fear, to target voters and to confuse voters. At the start of the pandemic in March, when it hit our shores at the United States, it was really important that the Leadership Conference and other organizations speak clearly to local and state election officials outside of all of the noise and politicization and toxicity of Washington. I want to underscore what Deputy Secretary Bates said, which is state and local election officials generally want to see the smooth operation of their elections and take great pride, regardless of party, in having that happen. When I was head of the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department, I worked with secretaries of states of both parties to get that done. But there was a real need for states to create many more options to be able to have a safe and secure and accessible election in the face of unprecedented challenges. And that meant not only standing up vote by mail systems with things like prepaid postage stamps, with secure and available drop boxes around the country, with the ability to have ballots that are postmarked on or by election day be counted, but also to ensure that there was expanded, safe in-person voting that would be compliant with social distancing guidelines, and to have poll workers be able to be at the polls, to keep those polling stations open, to prevent long lines that can be more unsafe during a pandemic. And then also extended voter registration. But even as we were pushing and working with secretaries of states to do this, working with Congress to fund the states and give states and local jurisdictions the resources to do this, it's still not adequate. There was an ongoing effort to really try to still limit the voting options for voters. And there still very much is this ongoing effort. And civil society has been really pushing on this to try to ensure that voters have options, and that even in the face of the attacks on the US Postal Service, on the attacks on mail-in voting and kind of mis and disinformation about a completely legitimate form of voting that has been used exclusively in 5 states for many, many years, and in many more states for many years without, major scandals or glitches. The attacks on drop box security and safety. We have to be centering our message to give voters confidence in the election. Because as I said, voter suppression isn't just about the impediments that are put in people's way to exercise the franchise. It's also about trying to use fear to get people to sit it out. And in this moment right now, it has been so challenging to both fight and advocate, whether it's with state and local election officials or members of Congress. There's litigators using the courts for this to try to protect our democratic infrastructure that is under strain like nothing we've ever seen before, while also reassuring voters that they actually have the power in this moment, that if they make a plan, and they make this plan now, and they can go to their Secretary of State's websites or their local election official websites, go to vote.org if you have no idea who your Secretary of State is, get your information, figure out, are you voting by mail, are you voting in person, and do it as early as possible. There's ballot tracking for folks that are reading these reports about rejected ballots and are worried about whether their ballot's going to get counted. That there are mechanisms and ways for voters to be totally empowered and to have a fair election, even amidst these unprecedented circumstances.
Thanks.
And for civil society, that is a central message, to be able to do both at once.
Thanks, Vanita, and thanks for that articulation of what voters can do, because that's really what we want to focus this conversation and try to understand how voters are thinking about this election. I want to bring Bill Kristol into the conversation. Bill, I know you spend a lot of time talking to voters all over the country from a variety of political backgrounds. The issues that Vanita described are really, some of them are traditional, not traditional, but voter suppression issues that have existed in the country for a long time. And what we're seeing is that they're being exacerbated in the current environment. The foreign influence piece is one that I think, at least from most people's perspective, was something that maybe the intelligence community knew that it existed for many years, and that the Russians have been doing things from time to time, although not on the scale of 2016 for a long time. But voters didn't really know until the reviews that were done of the 2016 election just how deep that influence was. And yet I struggle to understand whether voters really care about the foreign influence piece. I think the issues that Vanita is describing are ones that voters can understand because it's happening in their communities, and particularly if they are communities that have traditionally been on the receiving end of voter suppression efforts, then that's an issue that might not be unfamiliar to them. But foreign influence, it just doesn't necessarily seem to be resonating with the public, despite the fact that there was an impeachment hearing that was based on it. One of our, Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you in a second, though, but one of our individuals who wrote a piece for our commentary series, Dan Vallone, who works with the nonprofit More in Common, he wrote that Americans feel confronted with an overwhelming number of challenges. And when they're asked to describe that feeling, the one word that comes up again and again is the word exhausted. That Americans are just exhausted. And so, Bill, I wonder if you could just step in here now and talk about, what do you hear from voters when you talk to them about how they're feeling about the election, and does foreign influence even come into play?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie, and thanks for having me on this excellent panel. I think voters have a sense that it's a problem. They can't personally do much about it. They can't affect Russia's behavior, or they probably can't affect our own counterintelligence efforts and so forth. And they don't always see it as foreign influence, because successful foreign influence doesn't look like foreign influence. So I think voters are pretty aware that we're in uncharted waters and that we have real threats, and they're concerned about that. And I do think it is new. You know, each of these pieces has been around for a while, but the combination of Russia, Putin's Russia, which really has made a priority of affecting election results in other countries, not just the US, for quite a while, in a way that I think is a little unusual, you know, historically. And I'm not sure we've seen quite this focus on this particular form of interference with the new technology, social media and the internet and so forth, which again makes it's not like that, you know, we've had plenty of disinformation before, but it's a little more instantaneous, a little harder to track down, a little easier for bad actors to get things out there without their fingerprints on them, perhaps, than ever before. A little more massive just in its scope than ever before. And domestic disinformation, which again is not new. There have been demagogues, there have been direct mail pieces that were full of lies, there have been radio stations, talk radio hosts saying things and so forth. But again, the degree to which it's become sort of pervasive and acceptable almost for people to do. And then finally, an administration which does not fight at the very top level, the president, does not denounce it, does not seem to mobilize the government against it, and himself engages in disinformation and sort of turns a blind eye to the foreign side of it, to Putin. That combination, I do think, means we're on uncharted waters. I mean, I actually do think, just objectively, we are facing a threat that, if you add all these things together, is really different from the different threats we have faced over the years. Not necessarily worse. I mean, God knows voter suppression in the South, you know, in the past, as you could argue, as big a threat to our democracy and to justice as any of these things. But this particular constellation of threats coming together, I think, is maybe disruptive in a way that we haven't seen. Voters, I think, are alarmed about it. I think they're pretty aware of it and pretty much many of them have their guards up. But to be fair to them, it's not so easy to have your guard up. I mean, you don't have the ability as an individual voter. It's a little hard, let's just say, to sort of disentangle what's a reputable news site and what isn't, and so forth. I do think the good news is we have a US government that isn't entirely at the whim of one person, and we have a FBI and a CIA and other entities that fight this and report the truth, I think, on this. Just parts of the Justice Department, that's a little, but we have efforts to suppress also the truth telling, obviously, from government. So that's a little worrisome. We have a lot going on in civil society. That's very important. It's very good that we live in a country with massive private sector and civil society institutions that aren't simply at the beck and whim of one party or one president, and can tell the truth and can mobilize and can help people vote and do a lot of things that the federal government maybe should be doing more of, but isn't. Very good that we have a federalist system, or a system of federalism. It has its own drawbacks and its own inconveniences, and makes us more susceptible in certain ways to interference, because there's not one place you can just shut it down. On the other hand, looking at the situation today, I am happy that we have, secretaries of state and officials in Connecticut and many, many other states who are concerned and working hard to make their system work. And can't just be ordered around in terms of vote by mail or absentee ballots or how to run their election by Washington. So they need some help from Washington, as Scott said, but they don't take orders from Washington. And I think a lot of states have stepped up. Frankly, more of the Democratic states with Democratic governors and Democratic secretaries of state, but a lot of Republican secretaries of state are responding to the impetus of what their offices, what their responsibilities are, as opposed to their party loyalty, and some Republican governors, I would say, as well. And no one wants to really be a senior elected official in a state that runs a corrupt or an incompetent election, in which a lot of people can't vote, or which there are stories about scandals and so forth. So I think there's a certain impetus to make it work, if not by every single governor, or at least by other state elected officials, by state legislators, by major businesses in the state, by major organizations that can work in the state, and so forth. So I feel, given the challenges, which are really big, I think the country as a whole has done a pretty good job of meeting them so far. We won't know until November 3rd. We may not even know fully on November 3rd, obviously. But I think, I'm encouraged by the degree of mobilization. Does every citizen know that this mobilization is going on? Do they know what Vanita is doing or what Laura is doing? No, but I think they think it's good that people are making sure that we have, as much as they can, a free and fair election in November, in which the votes are counted accurately, and in which we have a democratic result.
So, Bill, I want to come back to the panel on that question of whether we know the election result by November 3rd. So I'm going to come back to that one. Now, I want to start off, Laura. I'm going to come to you, but then I'm going to ask my other panelists. We'll keep these responses a little bit more brief so that we can get through a few more issues. And I want to make this as interactive as we can in this format. Laura, I'll start with you on this one. But on the question, then, I think Bill's comments raised the question of what should the federal government, what should the intelligence community be telling the public about foreign influence? Because as he said, it's not like voters can, they don't necessarily know, they're not in the intelligence community. Just today, we've got an FBI director who is testifying about foreign threats, and we have an acting Secretary of Homeland Security who denied to appear before a committee. And we have an annual worldwide threat assessments that normally would have taken place by the intelligence community, which has never taken place this year for the first time in 25 years. A lot of my research in writing that I've done this summer has encouraged the intelligence community to be more forward-leaning about letting the public know when there is a hostile foreign intelligence and service trying to influence our election so that we don't end up in the same place. But Laura, can you weigh in on the different risks and responsibilities? I know you have some thoughts about whether more information can sometimes contribute to then sort of more confusion and chaos. So how much information should the government be giving people about foreign influence efforts? I'll start with Laura, and then others, please feel free to weigh in.
Well, thanks, Carrie. And it's a huge question, but I will try to be brief as you've asked us to be. But let me say, I think there's two components to this question. The first is that, frankly, and this stands true for any aspect of intelligence assessments, reporting, and sort of discussion with the public, is the public needs to know and be assured that what the intelligence community is saying is based on fact, is based on the reporting at hand, and is without political interference or influence in what is being said. And there are concerns about at least how some of the intelligence assessments have been characterized by officials outside of the intelligence community about whether or not there has been manipulation or mischaracterization of some of that intelligence. And of course, there's a whistleblower complaint before Congress right now that involves concerns about that. So I think the first thing is that the public needs to be ensured, as in all areas of intelligence, but especially in this space where it is so inherently political because of the topic at hand, that it is based purely on fact. So that's point one. Point two is that I do think there is this balance, as you suggested, between making sure that the intelligence community is being transparent with the public without essentially creating the self-fulfilling prophecy of instilling doubt in people's minds about the integrity of the process. And I'd say there's also two pieces to that. The first is that alongside of revealing the vulnerabilities and revealing the threats, the public needs to be ensured that steps are being taken to close off those vulnerabilities, the kinds of things that Scott was talking about in such clear terms, right, that have been done since 2016 to address parts of particularly the electoral infrastructure. That assurance alongside of the reporting on the threats is really, really important to making sure that the understanding of foreign interference doesn't undercut public faith in the integrity of the process. And the second piece is, I think that the public needs to have a high-level picture of what is going on, and when there are specific large-scale operations that are coming from foreign actors, to know that that's the case. But I think a tactical blow-by-blow of every little piece does begin to chip away at public faith. And so I think that there is a time and place for that in assessments after the election. But the key is to walk this line between transparency, exposing significant high-level operations, and then ensuring people that there are actions being taken to close off those vulnerabilities when they're identified.
Scott Bates, how does it look from on the ground at the state and local level?
Well, I was just kind of having a flashback to about 2002, because in 2002, I was part of the first staff of the Homeland Security Committee on Capitol Hill on the House side. And we struggled with two important questions. One was how to convey threat without freaking out the American people to the point where we couldn't take common action. And then the second was, what can the average citizen do? So right now, when we're talking about this, we've put aside about 10% of the budget we have for election day from the federal money we have for a public information campaign. That's letting people know how to vote by absentee, which, as I said, in Connecticut, they just weren't doing before. It wasn't really in the law. It was very restrictive. So we did that, drop it off at your Dropbox, step 1, 2, 3. And it's a constant form of communication that way to reinforce how to vote and that it's okay, and how to vote safe. We have a safe polls plan. We got every town in the state to sign off on it. And it's like, here are the protocols. And then we share that with the public. It's safe to vote in person, and it's safe to vote by absentee in your Dropbox. So we dedicate real resources to that. Then the other point I'd say is, actually, we can do a few things. And so we've engaged with we had our Register of Voters conference the other day, and we had, MITRE Corporation on there talking about the program where we can link local officials to, if they hear some weird social media rumor like, oh, the polling place is closed in Wallingford because of COVID, they pass it on to us, we track it down, and we can debunk. So it's really having an alert, engaged citizenry, understanding that's just going to be a few folks because most people have to go about their lives. And then with the general public, letting them know that it's okay, the fundamentals are sound, and move forward together. So it's a kind of dual track messaging.
Thanks, Scott. In terms of the messaging, Vanita, I'm going to come to you on this and get at an issue that Bill Kristol raised a little bit of earlier, which has to do with whether or not the outcome of the election is unsettled. As we all sit on our couches and watch election returns come in on November 3rd. Oftentimes we tend to stay up late and wait, and we think that, well, if we stay up till 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. or maybe even a little later, at least we'll have a good sense from exit polls. And yet I think many of us feel like that might not be the case for two reasons. One, because of the greater number of mail-in ballots, but also my sense is there's a lot of litigation pending. And I'm wondering, Vanita, if you can weigh in as to should we be expecting an election result on November 3rd? Do you think we're headed for some really scorched earth litigation? And if so, what that might look like?
Yeah, so this election, and I think I want to echo what Bill said, because I think it's really important. The constellation of factors may each individually have been with this country for quite some time, but coming together in this moment make this really unprecedented, which is why election night will not look anything like what we've seen before. I think it's really important for the American public and for the media to understand that if our democracy is actually working on November 3rd, the likely net outcome will be that we won't know who won the presidential election. And that's a really uncomfortable thing in a breaking news addicted environment that we all live in. I think in 2016, most of us had the result, by 9:15 at night. You just heard Deputy Secretary Bates talk about how Connecticut is going from a typically, you said 6% to 66% absentee voting. That means that the majority of Connecticut voters are casting their ballot by mail, and we have to give local and state election officials the time to actually count those ballots. There will be candidates, I can guarantee you, who will try to prematurely call election results, whether it's on November 3rd or November 4th. And there may even be local media that is very zealous, that wants to be the first out the gate to call election results based on exit polls of in-person voting. But because we're going to see unprecedented numbers of people voting by mail, we need to make sure that their votes and ballots are actually counted. And that may take, a few days, a day, many days. And added to this, the second part of your question, which is there is going to likely be litigation at a level we haven't seen before. Absentee ballots get rejected, and there's often a lot of questions about why they were rejected. Were they rejected because an official thought the signature didn't match? Well, was the voter given the opportunity to cure that match? Were ballots rejected for some other reason? Why were they rejected? They should have been counted. All the litigation around ballot counting is going to be taking place, and it'll be taking place at a much higher level than we've ever seen before because of the kind of, by tens of percentage points more voters that are actually voting by mail. The good news, and I'll stop here, is that a lot of the litigation that we're seeing take place right now are efforts and advocacy, not just litigation. Advocacy and litigation is really an effort to try to put in place rules that will prevent all of the kind of emergency back-end litigation after the election. So to try to have the right rules in place, the right ability of voters to cure their ballots within a reasonable time, all of these things, these are efforts really to set up a system in each of the states that will prevent kind of massive litigation on the back end. But this won't be like any election we've seen before. And I think it's really important for all of us to be prepared for kind of what democracy is going to look like, and to have patience and keep local and state election officials kind of free from undue pressure and even threats. We've even seen election officials under threat already in order to do their job and do the work that our democracy is going to call for in 2020.
Thanks, Vanita. Bill, I want to come to you on this question as well. And I want to underscore the fact that part of the reason that this is not just a traditional, this isn't just solely a domestic politics issue and it's a national security issue, is that confidence in our elections and the fair administration of our elections is what enables our government to function as the way it's designed. And that is a fundamental, in terms of protecting national security, that's making sure that our elections are fair is a fundamental issue. So Bill, can you speak to how do we foster confidence with voters, understanding that we might not have the results on November 3rd, and in the context of not only might we not have the results because of the pandemic, but we might not have the results because there could be foreign actors who are trying to exploit some of this domestic unsettledness.
I think people have done it, and the media has done a decent job and can do more to tell people that they may not know the winner at 11 p.m. on November 3rd. That's obviously happened before in 2000, a little bit in 2004. Kerry didn't concede till the next day because Ohio was still a little bit in question. So it's not, and it happened at the state and local level in different races. People are not totally unused to recounts and the vote changing, especially in the Western states, which have always had more mail-in ballots. So I'm not quite as worried about that as some people. I think voters will be calm and, and await the count of the ballot if they're told, hey, you know what, there are 800,000 ballots outstanding, so let's just count them. I do think some states count, people are a little exaggerate how much mail-in ballots can be counted and dumped and announced on the same night as the same day ballots. They are in Florida. I think they are in North Carolina. And those are two very important states that tend to come in early, actually. And one reason I knew, sitting on the set of ABC News on November 2016, I remember looking at the Florida stuff, and all the mail-in came in. Florida was half absentee at that point, and talking to my colleagues and thinking it's not coming out quite the way people expected. So I'm not so sure that we won't know, but we might not know. I think some states like Pennsylvania are trying to move up so they count earlier, count the mail-in ballots earlier, which is probably a wise idea. You don't have to, yeah, there's always some that will trickle in after Election Day, which you can count, but if you can count the bulk of them earlier, that's probably wise. So anyway, I'm not too worried about voters. I'm not too worried about the media. I think they can all adjust to this. I think states are going to try to be responsible. There is one big wild card, though, which is in 2016 and in 2018 in Arizona, where I think Martha McSally was ahead on election night and ended up losing, not even that close a race, really, to Kristen Sinema and other places. The one big wild card is we've never had a president who personally is using his pretty big bully pulpit to call into question the notion that mail-in ballots are legitimate or that their state officials are doing things honestly. And that's a big problem. I mean, we shouldn't be too abstract in this discussion. Would it be if we had a, as I put it in terms of Scott, if Scott was doing what he was doing in Connecticut and the president of the United States was saying, you know what, we want to help every state make sure this works well. And it's obviously up to them how exactly they arrange some of these things, but we're going to be there to help them and make sure, and I want to reassure everyone that we're absolutely committed to having an honest and clear and transparent election and waiting for the votes to be counted. If you had a president saying that, Scott's job would not be hard. I mean, Connecticut's a good government state, so maybe it won't be hard anyway, but that hard. But and the media's job wouldn't be that hard, and the civil society job wouldn't be that hard. There'd still be disputes over, more traditional disputes, let's put it that way, about maybe some areas don't have polling booths open, and there is some monkeying around at the state and local level. Having a president, echoed probably by some of his other senior officials, really trying to cause trouble, frankly, rather than reassure people and help solve the problem, is a problem. Now, in a funny way, we're alert enough to it that people probably can guard against it to some degree. But that's what makes this particularly worrisome. It could be, very close elections can be a mess anyway. Look at 2000. At the end of the day, we made it through that because both candidates and both parties were committed to trying to, they had slightly different interpretations of how to count the vote and so forth, but everyone sat there and dutifully waited as Florida individually counted votes from with a bizarre ballot and, in Broward County and so forth. And people looked at each hanging chad, and the country didn't erupt, and people were unhappy about the result. The country did not erupt in flames or violence or a fundamental crisis, I wouldn't say, for our democracy. But we didn't have a president then who was trying to stir things up. And so that's a problem we can't control. We can alert people ahead of time not to let him do it. And I think people are trying their best to do that. But he is one of the two candidates. So it is that worries me the most.
I want to go to Vanita and then Laura with comments.
Just really quickly, I think that the analogy to 2000 may be really an understatement of what we are likely to see in this election, in part because the political environment in our country is in such a polarized place that that the kind of seeding of doubt of the legitimacy of the election that many of us believe the president is very intentionally engaging in when attacking mail-in voting. This country is there is a real sense of kind of what is at stake in this election. There's going to be litigation that is at a far kind of greater exponential rate than what we saw in 2000 because of this surge in mail-in voting. And I think the country is charged up, and there's a real, concern about making sure that any effort to protect our democracy in the aftermath is constructive, that it gives the space to state and local election officials to do their jobs, that there's, to the extent there's energy out in the streets, that it's nonviolent. And there's, so it isn't to alarm people, but I just think that 2020 in America is not 2000. And so what we need to be bringing to this, and it's not just in terms of the legal ramifications and litigation, but also I just think in terms of where we are as a nation. And so I think it's been important that states have been trying to figure out, can they start to count, like Pennsylvania, like Bill said, start to count ballots in real time and not be so crushed after November 3rd, and holding people in abeyance, which is not a good thing for any of us and for our democracy. But it's this need to really recognize the unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in, and to take the precautions that we can, understanding what 2020 is like in this country right now.
Thanks for that, Laura.
Yeah, I just want to build on some of what Vanita just said, and while I very much hope that Bill is right in his optimism for how a lot of constituencies and actors will handle this election night and thereafter, I would just note for me what's the cautionary tale of the night of the Iowa caucuses and the morning after in February. When the caucus results were delayed because an app malfunctioned. And that led to cable news pundits saying things like, well, we have no evidence that the app was hacked. However, we know that there's a huge hacking problem out there, and so we don't know that it wasn't hacked. And we had mass disinformation spreading on social media rapidly about whether different political activists or operatives in the Democratic Party who had an interest in one candidate or another had been involved in testing the app or funding the app. We had different candidates who themselves, multiple candidates actually, who said things essentially hinting that they believe there may have been some form of foul play. And then we had people who were saying the fact that the Iowa Democratic Party was going through what they called a quality control process to in fact count the paper backups that they had of the caucus tallies, right? They had actual paper backups, which is the good news story. But people saying that quality control process was in fact essentially the way that they were rigging things. And so while I totally agree with Bill that the president is a major new and X factor here, I do think that a lot of actors who are going to be involved across many different parts of this process are going to have to almost resist our instincts and the way we've become primed, as Vanita suggested, to believe that in fact there is a lack of integrity. And in fact, lean into the idea that until we know credibly that there has been a problem, we should not speculate on it, because that is what's going to prime the public to not actually accept the outcome of the election. And that is in fact the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say the good news on that is that the Iowa, Democratic Party, I mean, our parties are sort of weird private organizations. They're not always very good at doing things. We do have state governments. They do have governors. They do have people like Scott who have done this before and who know how to do this. And if they speak consistently, and it's like if they say, look, we've run this election, there are a couple of questions about this particular place, we're counting these votes, some of these will be later, I think that can go a long way towards preventing a kind of, we had no one had any idea what the Iowa Democratic Party was doing, and they didn't seem to have much of an idea either. So that, I think, is good news. There's a huge responsibility, in my view, on state governments and governors. I think this particularly means, since Republican president is going to be challenging the fairness of it all and the honesty of it all, Republican governors particularly need to stand up. But they have a certain incentive to. It is their state. I mean, how exactly do they explain that they would have let it all go in a terrible way if they're supposed to be in charge of their state? Now it's the issue of secretaries of state and governors. It gets a little complicated, but I think it's important for them to understand what the situation. Governors in the past, my impression is, and Scott can correct me on this, you know, they were sort of like, you take care of the election and I assume it'll be fine. I'm going to be busy preparing my, you know, remarks for going forward on whatever, my state of the state address or something. Governors now need to be serious about their responsibility as the elected official in that state to pull off a legitimate and fair election. And if they're not frankly committed to it, other senior state officials and state actors and here civil society makes a difference, need to be committed to that. So I think that would be the only thing. If they could consistently give a reassuring message, yeah, there'll be a lot of insanity, and I mean, it could do damage on social media and by irresponsible politicians and so forth. But the governors can do a lot of good. I am curious. I mean, Scott, I'd like actually Scott would be, I think, interesting in this. And are you in Connecticut? So with the 65% or whatever it's going to be absentee, are you going to count them early? I mean, are you going to be ready to announce them on election night, or are you going to? Is it going to go after?
Funny you should ask. We were having this conversation just hours ago, and you know, a lot of the little towns will have no trouble counting them, although they've never had that crush before. The larger cities, we're looking at ways to help them. Some of it might have to be legal, and then within that, technological. So, you know, the debate we had internally was there's pressure to have an early, accurate count, obviously. And my take was yes, and ultimately, for people to be confident in their electoral system, we can't go back and say, oh, well, that thing that we got it wrong, but it's really okay. So it's super important that there be an accurate count. And if it's not as quick as a former political junkie like me would like, that's okay. So back to Vanita's point as well, you know, we have to prepare folks. It may not be as quick as the usual.
Great, Scott, I'm going to stick with you. We're running down on our time now. I'm going to come back to each of my panelists for about a 20-second final thought. And I'm wondering if you just could comment on, this is totally unfair to do, by the way, in a short response, but I'm going to ask if you can give our viewers a sense of what's the best way that we can not allow a foreign government to exploit some of these domestic issues, which is one of the major reviews, conclusions from the reviews in 2016. And I'm just going to try to get each of yours with a quick thought before I offer some concluding remarks. Scott, I'll stick with you.
Sure. So the threat from foreign influence in American elections is real. It will be persistent. It'll be ongoing for years to come. But here's the good news. As we speak, there's tens of thousands of local election officials who are totally invested, regardless of party or any background, in making sure democracy is protected and making sure the count is accurate. And we're all in this together. So 3 things come to mind on how to tackle this threat now and ongoing. Number 1, it's a national priority. So even though our system is decentralized, Congress needs to continue to do an annual appropriation to support American election infrastructure. 2, there have to be partnerships at the state and local level with law enforcement in terms of cybersecurity, with civil society in terms of protection of rights, and across localities. And finally, is public engagement. Every state's going to have to set aside money to keep talking with its public about what the voting system is and the way to vote safely and securely. So, you know, I'm optimistic long term, but it's a new national priority that we have to keep our eye on.
I agree with everything that Scott just said, so I won't repeat it, but I will add 2 things. One, we have to depoliticize this issue. The politicization of foreign interference is both one of the greatest vulnerabilities to it and one of the greatest obstacles to addressing it. This cannot be a partisan or political issue, and we absolutely have to get out of this cycle. The second thing we have to do is to actually address those domestic vulnerabilities that are providing the fodder for these foreign actors. Racism is a national security problem. Economic inequality that is creating so many challenges in our country is creating massive, massive vulnerabilities to be exploited, for conspiracy theories to be seeded on fertile ground. We need to take these vulnerabilities seriously from a national security perspective, understanding that they are weakening us from within and putting us on a footing where we're both vulnerable to our adversaries and weaker in actually competing with them.
So I will just build on what my two colleagues have said and appreciate the efforts and the longstanding and ongoing efforts even beyond 2020 that we're going to need to focus on to fight foreign interference in our elections, understanding the very thick domestic roots that it has. But I think it's really important right now that one of the strongest things that we can do as members of the public, as voters, in the face of the concern around and the threat, very real, of foreign interference in our elections, is to stay focused. That voters have power to make sure that they do not get distracted from all of the discussions of all of the threats, that they understand there are good people working on them who won't relent on them, but to basically make a plan to vote, figure it out, how you're going to vote in this unprecedented election, and vote as early as possible to relieve pressure off of state and local election officials who are trying to do their job and ensure a fair election. Because I think that focus is going to matter so much in the short term to get this election done and in a fair way and in a way that gives everyone the confidence that our democracy so depends on.
I would just say to voters, citizens, don't believe what you read on social media necessarily. Check it, and don't believe what you see either in terms of deep fakes and videos. So people just need to be more suspicious than they have been sometimes in the past, and that's just a price we pay for the system we have now. And maybe it'll be fixed by various reforms in the future, but it's not going to be fixed in the next 6 weeks, that's for sure. And listen to public officials who you can trust, who are not so partisan, who are trying to make this work. Don't listen to political leaders who are politicizing it on either side. I think it's more on one side, frankly, and more from one place. I come back to the president because he has such a unique bully pulpit, but don't listen to others either who are just rabble rousing. Listen to public officials who are trying to help make the system work, and then vote and make sure your vote gets vote early, and encourage everyone else to vote.
Thanks so much. Our hour went by quickly. Laura Rosenberger, Bill Kristol, Vanita Gupta, and Scott Bates, thank you all for joining us and sharing your expertise with us today. There are so many people working across this country to keep this election free of interference, keep it secure, have it administrated fairly so that everyone's vote can count. And thank you for taking your time out of the day to join us for this. Appreciate everybody's participation, and we will be placing the recording of this session as well as our earlier one today on the Center for New American website. And please look later this afternoon. We'll also be releasing an interview that Claire Finkelstein and I did with the CISA director, Chris Krebs. To my four panelists, thank you so much for joining us today. We're grateful for your participation.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you.